All right. Hi, everybody. It's the On the Couch podcast where we talk about Couchform and the ideas behind it.
Yep.
Yeah. So, today we're going to talk about conflict. Pretty broad term on its own. Can be a lot of things, but we're going to talk about specifically what we think behind it and why it's so important to drive these thematic conflicts that we look for. Before we do that, we're going to do the intros.
Yes. Hi. I'm Silent. I guess I've been here doing VR chat role plays for I think it's officially been 3 years. Yes, it is now July. It has officially been 3 years now.
Oh, wow.
Um and I've played in a few role plays. I've run a few role plays, and also with the help of Solus and some lovely other people, we have now made our own school of thought on role plays. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, we did do that, didn't we?
Yeah, we definitely have.
Sorry, I'm on a whole level today. Okay, so it's my turn, I guess. My intro isn't going to change too much. I'm Solus, been a role player in this community for a bit over 4 years. Have transitioned mostly from not understanding too much and just playing and figuring things out to uh, doing a lot of theory crafting and coming up with what we've got here, which is Couchform. And now we actually talk about it, which is cool. I also, funny enough, I have realized I have a cat. She's very loud. And for whatever reason, she has decided not to enter during any of the podcasts so far. But she has been around a bit right beforehand today. So I definitely feel like she's going to be around today. We'll see, though. She is very loud.
Hmm.
She'll just yell at me for no reason whatsoever. It's great. All right. So, Scylla,
Yep.
I have a question for you.
Uh huh.
What is conflict?
Well, you see, according to local scriptman, conflict is the state of being in which characters reveal things about themselves.
This was entirely unplanned. I'm just springing this on Scylla. Totally messed up of me.
Yeah.
But that's a good point, right? So, conflict is a state of being in which characters reveal something about themselves. Like,
I've forgotten. See, that was also off the top of my head, and I forgot that was the bold line. I'm now looking at the Couchform principles, and I forgot that was the bold line right under their heading for conflict. Uh, I just quoted local scriptman without remembering that you put that in there.
it's all coming together. It's all coming together.
Yeah,
This is by design. I've been planning this months in advance. You see,
yeah.
all leading up to today. So let's talk about that idea, though, right? Conflict is a state in which characters reveal something about themselves. So let's dig a little bit deeper, right? What does that mean and why? Why do characters reveal things about themselves in conflict, right? So I want to rewind a bit and think about stuff that we've already talked about. We have talked about the core of Couchform being this thematic focus, building off of themes, constructing around themes. And we've also talked about um, elements of design and safety. I guess not necessarily relevant in the state of like characters, but and we've also talked about playing the lift, right? The big thing here, the big kind of tie-in comes with themes, as far as kind of a literary perspective, right? Because when we have these very deliberately chosen themes that we're building around, this thematic focus on the story, then what we've defined as far as the theme for Couchform is that this is a thing that characters will disagree about. It's the thing that they will find differences on, and conflict is difference. It's a evidence of difference in perspective. That is what it is at its core. So when a character perceives something that differs from a thematic perspective, then they start to question and challenge things that they have already understood. And then that's how, depending on what they decide, character decision is character progression, and the conflict that creates that need for decision is drama. Right? We're equating the two. Because without conflict, a character has no need to make those sorts of decisions. And without those sorts of decisions, a character doesn't define anything about themselves. They don't progress in the eyes of the perceiver, whoever is following this character, whether it's the player themselves or someone viewing them or another player, right? What a character decides and evidences about themselves progresses them as a character. This is why, I don't know, maybe like, I think it was like 7th, 8th grade when we looked at the graph of like of the story structure. I forget exactly the name of the curve, right? But you have your like exposition, your kind of introduction to the story, saying what the world is and the characters, what they are, and then you have your rising conflict, which effectively leads actions into what is called climax, which is kind of the apex point, that the turning point of the story. And then you have your resolution, right? That gradual ramp down to the point where the story ends at whatever state it does, and then you get there. But that rising action is the conflict that leads up to the climax, right? And you can't have that climax without the conflict that leads up to it. So, very much speaking in like a very base literary sense, that this is very core to how stories and media that we consume nowadays already work. So this is something we're effectively looking to structuralize and bring into VR roleplay as like a core basis of how we're interacting with these themes.
Yeah, and I do think a sort of state of conflict is when you really find out like who a character or like who a person really is. Um like you can totally get to know somebody, right? Like when things are fine and dandy and like everybody's getting along and it's all great. Everything's great. You can, get to know a person, you can get to know a character in that sort of situation. But you'll really kind of get to the core of who that character is when you are in a situation when things aren't going right. That's when you really find out, like, you can really dig into, well, who are they really? And when I say you, I mean the person playing the character, but also, the people around them can, better understand, like, who is this character. Um,
Right. So I don't know what my cat just did, but she toppled something over. My God, she's a little nuts today. Um, so one thing that I've realized is perspective on conflict kind of differs quite a bit, and I've kind of noticed this throughout my time talking with different role players and going through different role plays that involve some form of conflict at a very base level of like what conflict actually means. And one thing that I found is very common is that conflict is perceived to be this kind of all or nothing state where you either have this very large, aggressive sort of conflict where you're either arguing with someone or yelling or actually violently, you know, in some sort of violence, or maybe a combat encounter or something of the sort like that. That's what a lot of people see as conflict. We're breaking that down quite a bit. So this I feel like is why a lot of players tend to be very averse to it. And this is a criticism that I will levy every time that it comes up. That I genuinely find that a lot of players are like far too averse to conflict and shouldn't be. Honestly, it's very fun to have it, but we break it down by saying once again that a conflict is an evidence in perspective. Sorry, cat's actually scratching the couch. Gotta stop her. We we define it as an evidencing of difference of perspective, right? And that, at its very core, doesn't require these like large arguments or fights to happen. They don't even require two people, right? You can have one person that sees a sign on a wall and that creates a conflict. That can drive a lot of things forward if you start to kind of break that idea down and kind of zoom back and think, okay, what can really present itself as a conflict to this character? What kind of internal conflict can I drive with that, and how can I make this story more fulfilling, and how can I bring that to other characters? Uh, that alone kind of adds this dimension to how you address conflict as a player.
Cat.
And
Okay,
she's
Solus,
kind of
I have a question for you, and as well as your cat.
okay.
Is I it's been forever since like English class, but I very distinctly remember just like back in English class, kind of like studying like types of stories, and there was this like chart of like person versus person, person versus society, person versus nature, person versus self, and then so on and so forth, kind of like analyzing like different types of conflicts and stories. I feel like this is like a thing, right? Like, are you have you like ever heard of that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, yeah. I suppose it's kind of just to say I can't find like I can't really find like I don't think there's like a consensus where it's like, oh, there are exactly like these many types of conflicts in stories. But I suppose that in and of itself, evidences that there are, many, many, many different types of conflict that you can tell and you can have in a story. Like really, really, really different types of conflict. And well, every single one of those types of conflict is going to reveal something about its characters. Um, of course, you know, fighting is, I suppose, easy. It's something that's easy to get characters to care about because I feel like unless you have like the ultimate like nihilist character, I feel like every character is going to care about not dying. So it's it's pretty easy to like introduce fighting like physical violence as a type of conflict into your roleplay because you can be pretty certain that like pretty much every single character is going to care about not dying. And even if the character, right, and like even if like the person is like playing like kind of like a nihilist character, you can be pretty certain that the role player is at least going to care about their character not dying and therefore, having to leave the role play. Um, so in that sense, violence is easy, right? Violence is easy because you can be pretty safe to assume that all characters are going to care about, you know, not being on the receiving end of violence at the very least. Um, Other types of conflict, however, can be like, significantly more nuanced and do not have to come with the threat of death attached. Um, it's just, because, you don't have the threat of death attached, you're also more likely to have a character that can't necessarily engage in that type of conflict, right? A character that, isn't necessarily equipped to care about those things, um, which can make it, difficult unless you plan this out in your role play ahead of time.
I want to bring up an example that 404 mentioned in the Myriad, that
Hmm.
they brought up an example of a kind of conflict style where it was presented as, this is not the story about how the trying to stop the necromancer from destroying the Olympics. This is a story about how you stop the necromancer from winning the Olympics. And that, just one word of reframing, fully changes the conflict, right? Now you have this like kind of well enclosed, sort of interesting conflict where you have to. It's a bit of a funny angle, and it's using humor to kind of uh, to better contain and relate to the material of the conflict, right? Because it's a bit
Gives me
silly, right?
wacky races vibe.
Yeah, but it's conflict does not need to be fatal or potentially fatal, which is, again, the violence is easy. Is easy because, again, every character at some point values something about what is at stake, uh, no matter what. If you have violence, right?
Yeah, I suppose I suppose I should probably, lead off with, like, uh easy, doesn't necessarily mean bad, lots and lots of story, like there have been lots and lots of great stories told off the back of, fighting and violence and combat and et cetera, right? So you can have lots of great stories. Um I suppose the reason that, like, I like to think about different types of conflict is, just for that, the sake of variety, right? There's just so many
Mm-hmm.
different things to explore, right? And it's I like exploring. I like experimenting, especially. So, different types of conflict inherently interest me. It's also, I feel like, violence, especially physical violence, I feel like can be quite stressful. And like, um this is I feel like a potentially one of the reasons why a lot of role plays in our sphere tend to alternate between, okay, now's the time for combat, now's the time for socializing, because, physical, like, violence is really, really stressful. Not to say that other types of conflict aren't stressful, right? But like, the threat of dying is like kind of like the ultimate stress, that
Right.
you can put on somebody, right? Like life or death is kind of like the ultimate stressor. So like, um I think that's part of the reason that we tend to make a divide between these two modes of role plays. It's just, people need a break, right? Like, gosh, like I can't imagine being in a role play where there is actually a threat of characters dying, right? And it's not just kind of like, hand waved. So there is actually a threat of characters dying, and just being in that, like, constantly all the time with no breaks at all, right? I think that's one of the things that the sort of town role play attached to your otherwise combat role play. That's kind of one of the functions of that town role play, of, going back to base and like talking with the other characters, is to kind of de-stress from that threat. Um, which, I mean, is certainly a good thing, right? Certainly a good thing that happens, right? But with other types of conflict, I'm not sure if such a, like, a harsh divide between, okay, now we're fighting, okay, now everybody gets along. I don't think such a strong divide is necessary. Um, if you plan out your conflicts.
It's also like not as easy, right? Because I think that with those kind of conflicts also comes like this feeling of tension that like isn't really easy to decouple. Because with violence, you have the tension and it is directly tied to the act of violence. And if you're not doing the act of violence, then there's no tension of act of violence, right? But if you do have your sort of more nuanced thing and you leave at a point of tension, which you usually will end up doing if you have some sort of like continuing progressing story, then it's like you're not really ever going to decouple from that, but it's fine because the stress isn't like the ultimate stress, right? This like
Mm-hmm.
tension, this feeling of suspense that something is going to happen is like one of the most powerful things that could be used for like very high quality
Mm-hmm.
conflict storytelling. Like one of the things I always talk about with even with combat, like you don't need to keep throwing enemies at your players. Sometimes you can just sit back and make a couple noises, and with that just little bit of effort, you can create this atmosphere that can be like 10 times as full as if you had 10, 20 uh, NPCs or whatever you want to call them throwing at the players at any given point in time.
Mm-hmm.
I also just looked up the name of the plot chart, and it's Freytag's Pyramid. That's what it's called. The rising action, falling action kind of stuff. Yeah, that's what
I
it's called.
see. As far as I can tell, like people can't seem to agree on like how to categorize stories, and in my non-expert opinion, that's probably because well, you can just do a lot of things, right? And all of these are just like lenses to analyze different things.
Otan says combat also doesn't exist only in the form of violence too. Uh, I'm curious what you mean by that. Can you elaborate?
I think I do. I think I have an idea. Um, for like the standoff, right? Um, though I would like to let you elaborate on.
I guess if we are thinking standoff like Cold War, like the threat of something about to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Threats, debates, conflicts, and interests that result in consequences. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess Otan actually was the one who introduced me to a specific mechanic, and I've recently found a different roleplay mechanic, which I posted here in the Myriad. I'll just read off of this one since it's easier to read off of it than it is to kind of like remember exactly how Otan was describing it. But the mechanics were really similar, and it was this like sci-fi like spaceship LARP, where like everybody was on a spaceship, and this LARP contained firearms, but they didn't have firearms to be like a sort of tight corridor clearing rooms, right? It wasn't any of that, right? You weren't fighting any aliens. Um, the firearms were present in this role play to create drama, and the way they did that is that specifically, if a weapon of any sort, especially a firearm, was drawn, if anybody in a room kind of like drew a firearm, that means that they control the room. Everybody else in the room is now being controlled by the person who's wielding the firearm. Um, that person with the gun, they get to make demands. They get to um, kind of be in that position of power that the gun provides them. No one was going to do any sort of like heroic like last minute rescues. It's just like you know you win. But the reason isn't to win, right? The reason that you're doing this isn't to kill everybody in the room. The reason that you have this is to kind of play up on that like paranoia, to play up on that on those power dynamics that kind of result from having deadly weapons in a in close quarters, like in like tight corridors and tight rooms. Um,
Mhm.
and yeah, and I mean, you can kind of a character could then like really like take that floor, with the threat of death, kind of like at their command, and then then they were expected to like give up that floor at some point in time. But the purpose of the mechanic, once again, is not to kill each other in character, but rather to create this power dynamic for characters to use to create and maximize drama.
Mhm.
I don't know if that technically counts as combat. Um, it does seem like they did have like they I suppose it's not so much of a back and forth, but as maybe like a like a verbal spar. But
She
but
says
hey, I mean it's guns, as yeah, close enough to combat for me. Otan says, or combat enough for me. Otan says so.
combat enough
You
for
know.
me. It's a good wording. Yeah, I looked into this LARP very briefly because I read the mechanic that Silent
Mhm.
posted, and I checked out like the wording is cool. Like I thought that was genuinely a really good way to think about guns in most contexts, where if a character genuinely values their own life and they are confronted with a firearm pointed at them, then they will very likely want to acquiesce to whatever the other person's demands are, right? They're fearing for their life, right? And I looked at this roleplay, this LARP a little bit because I was a bit curious, and I just wanted to see what it was about. And basically, the front page of it talks about how it is a roleplay about fear and power in these kind of dark situations. And I was like, yeah, that checks out, right? Because it makes sense. You look at the mechanic and it evidences exactly what they're trying to do thematically. Uh, I am alluding a little bit to number 8, which we will Couchform number 8, I should say, which we'll get into further down the road. But it is one of those things where theme should generally just be present in everything, or at the very least echoed or evidenced somehow. And this is kind of a really cool
Well,
way that they did it.
they'll come up whether you like it or not. So
Yeah.
it's probably better to be aware of how they're going to be coming up rather
Yeah.
than letting them come up by accident.
There is kind of like a point at which if you just build with themes in mind, then you kind of just like somehow accidentally evidence them in some ways. Like I was mulling through some like visual design for Legacy, which is a roleplay that I'm making, and at some point I was thinking through some of the map design elements that I wanted to make in it, and I was thinking emotions in various areas, like what kind of roleplay would happen in certain areas, and what kind of things would people want to see. And I immediately thought
Hmm.
there is this like kind of tone of vulnerability that I want to aim for, and then we had this conversation like either yesterday or a couple days before, Dylan, uh, that there is this kind of like feeling of vulnerability that I want to happen in the most central area because it's open.
Hmm.
Anything could happen in there, and most things will happen in there because it's kind of a crossroads, and that crossroads will kind of resemble the destructuralizing of the status quo and how characters will kind of restructure their thinking, how they will decide what they truly believe in as the foundation kind of crumbles, and then that center being like a place of significance and openness would kind of represent that sort of vulnerability. And that was like just me kind of manifesting that. But like months ago, I had already kind of decided that that was going to be an element in the map, right? I wasn't thinking about that until like a few days ago. But the idea was always there. So I thought that was kind of cool. I don't know.
Hmm.
Things kind of come together as long as you got the right mindset. But back to conflict. Right. So it's not easy, and the reason why I say this is it's not easy to just manifest a conflict out of nowhere, right? And
Yeah.
in a sense, this kind of ties in to what we believe to be the core duty of the GM, and this kind of ties into plot, right? How to organize plot that creates conflict that challenges the perspectives of the characters, and the characters carry it on after that. If you have just kind of the empty space where everything's kind of going fine, then it's hard to kind of manifest conflict out of the blue, right? Everyone's agreeing, and you're the first one to disagree. It's a bit weird. So, uh,
Hmm. And it can, it can, if you kind of like have that atmosphere, um, of like not working it into your design, it can be like really socially isolating to want to explore, these sorts of things. I
mhm.
actually have an example. I'll get to that in a moment, but
Okay.
like it can be really a social isolating because like if the role play if your role play is kind of like what I would describe as like a free for all, where you just have like characters milling about and like looking and like you the role player are looking for ways in character to kind of like connect to other characters, and this stuff hasn't been planned out by the GMs or staff ahead of time. um then there is like an enormous social pressure to make your characters likable by everybody, um because if your character is not likable, then naturally characters will probably characters that kind of have similar views and similar ideas will probably you know get along better than characters that don't, right? I mean that makes sense, right? um it's not absolutely that's not super crazy. um the sort of tragedy that happens, right, is that this kind of gets taken to the extreme because it's absolutely possible to have characters that get along just fine, like 99% of the time, and they have this like one thing that they disagree on, right? This like one thing. um but if your role play kind of isn't set up for this, you're kind of like and people kind of have to fend for themselves and kind of getting this character interaction, and you're being encouraged to make characters that are as likable as possible. Everybody's kind of going to trend towards all the characters believe in exactly the same thing all the time, so they all get along, so that you have as big of a group as possible to be with.
Hmm.
It just doesn't always happen, right? Like it certainly doesn't always happen. um but you do end up getting relatively, I feel like in most role plays that I've seen, you end up getting like relatively homogenous ideals, like characters that have relatively homogenous ideals. They might disagree on like what their favorite food is, but like every character is going to have like modern, uh you know sort of liberal, democratic ideologies, right? Just that's just the culture that we inhabit in this space, and that's the sort of thing that's kind of seen as like the default, and so people are going to like tend towards what is seen as the default to try to interact with as many people as possible. And if you're going to go outside of that space, right, if people who are going to try to explore outside of that space tends to do so very cautiously, just kind of like testing the waters, just a little bit, just enough to cause like the tiniest bit of conflict, but like not too much to socially isolate themselves from others. And as somebody who likes exploration through roleplay, I think that's a tragedy. Not to say that every roleplay has to be about exploring very like in-depth ideological stuff. The part of this that I think is a tragedy is that um, so the social pressure that kind of ends up winning leads you to not being able to explore these things. I'll let you talk in a moment. I can give a concrete example. Um, I tried. I had a character idea that I was really. I am. I still. I say. I say I was really excited, but I still am really excited to play. Um, I really wanted to make get back into metaverse roleplay and make a metaverse character. And the idea that I came up with was someone who is explicitly not a pacifist, but someone who is deeply and strongly opposed to casual violence. They're not even opposed to violence. They're just opposed to the violence being casual. Um, Anybody who's done any amount of metaverse roleplay will know exactly what I'm talking about. Um, but there is a whole lot of casual violence going on in metaverse roleplay usually. And I thought that okay, this would be my my dipping my toes in the water, very like tepid exploration of conflict in this space, right? Where like this is why I'm not playing a pacifist character. That would never work. I'm not playing somebody who's opposed to I'm not playing somebody who's opposed to violence. I'm playing somebody who's just specifically opposed to the violence being casual. They don't care about violence, they care about it being casual. Um, I load into an instance of the me track. My first day playing this character, I load in, I go in there. Um, there's a Snorlax blocking the door to the bar, and everybody around me is just like yelling at the Snorlax to move. Then like one of them gets out their gun and starts unloading it to the Snorlax, and then everybody else in the lobby also gets out their guns and starts shooting the Snorlax. And I'm just like sitting there, I'm like, I can't play this character. I literally can't. I could go out there, kind of guns blazing and be like, man, this is wrong, right? Like I could do that as my character, but it would actually at that point, with how, one-sided it obviously was, where like, everybody was just having fun and like shooting the Snorlax. Um, I'm not going to go and like yuck on their yum and be like, well, actually this is serious. Like clearly they were just having fun. So, but in that moment I thought to myself, I'm like, I can't play this character. It's just it's just too much, too it would be too socially isolating. There would be maybe like one or two other characters in this entire in the entire space of metaverse roleplay that I could speak to without like being completely and totally opposed to them, right? Um, because it was just too far, right? It was just too far. Casual violence is I would say, a mainstay of most metaverse roleplay. Um, and that's kind of like and that's kind of like a thing. I then made the decision, right? Like I have this character that is opposed to casual violence. I cannot really explore this conflict in this space. And so I have yet to play this character to this day, even though I'm very excited to maybe one day get to. But yeah, and that's sort of what I mean by this like tragedy of like there are certain types of conflicts that are kind of require a bit of setup to be able to be explored. And I really want to explore those things, that is a personal desire of mine. I would like to see role plays and see spaces in which those types of conflicts can be explored.
When I tell you, my head went straight into my hands as I heard about the players unloading their magazines into the Snorlax.
That was the first thing. This was literally the
Oh,
first thing that I saw as I entered the lobby. I swear I have been at the meat track more times than that, and like it gets pretty rowdy in there, but it's from the times that I've been in there, it's usually not that bad. but like I was being, I suppose, a bit too optimistic, right? I think I was
Mm,
being like I was really excited to play the character, so I was being, probably a bit more optimistic than I should have, to be like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna play this character. I'm super excited, super excited. And it kind of like, blinded me to the fact, to the very obvious fact that this character would just not work. It would not work in the space. I say space rather than setting because, of course, metaverse roleplay is very interconnected.
right.
And I think because it's very interconnected, right? Because characters from one roleplay and metaverse roleplay can go to different other roleplays. Because of that, you very much do tend to have these characters that kind of know their place to say, right? They tend to stay out of other people's conflicts that and like you can't really make your opinion known except inside your small group, right? In your small corner of metaverse roleplay where you're role playing with your group, there is space for conflict, but in the wider sort of open area, it's really difficult, and you have to be really careful um, with the sort of types of with the type of conflict that you want to evidence.
Yeah, I found like what makes metaverse conflict extremely difficult is there's no shared urgency, right? Like I have seen some metaverse wide conflicts that scale to obnoxious proportions because you have everything from the kind of street thug to like literal gods walking in humanoid form because they can, right? It's just like there's no shared perspective of what actually is
Oh yeah,
happening. So, how do you
yeah.
make a conflict that works for both of these sorts of like things? Even just power
You
level
really
wise.
can't. Gosh, I remember back in my time in gang roleplay. I remember there was the announcement for when the Black Ram is invading the metaverse, right? And there is like this huge, war between the dimensions, right? And we're just sitting there with like our gang characters, kind of just like looking at that and just kind of like nodding, like, uh-huh, yeah, sure. And like it was specifically in the rules of gang roleplay that like we're not allowed to get involved in this sort of stuff. So yeah, we're just kind of just like, yeah, sure, uh-huh. Very interesting. You do your thing. Um yeah, so it's I suppose now that I'm talking about it, I feel like I misspoke at the beginning of this I feel like I misspoke at the beginning of this podcast now that we're talking about it, that
Oh,
you know, violence gets everybody kind of interested. And to an extent it kind of does, with the asterisk that it gets all the characters who are able to be involved interested. If your character is not able to be involved in the violence, well, you're in a role play, and that role play over there, their characters are dealing with the world-ending threat, but you're
yeah.
not, and you have no way of you have no way of participating in that. It's kind of, difficult to pretend to care when there's another one of these every week, um, because people need breaks, right? People need breaks from the constant state of like world-ending threat, and just because your group hasn't done a world-ending threat in over a year, uh, there is a world-ending threat, every other month in a metaverse roleplay. So
Mhm.
if you are not the one involved, it becomes kind of difficult to care. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think I misspoke about violence being. I still think it's easy, but it doesn't automatically make everybody care. For that reason.
So you surfaced a memory, a deep-seated memory of mine that I didn't bring up before, and now I have to. So I still have an example waiting in the back of my brain, but this one's in the front now. I have a clip that's very notorious from Fracture Thrones because at this point I had created a character that is entirely non-combative and is this kind of greedy motherfucker that just wants to like make as much money as possible and get the hell out, right? Uh, and at some point, like leading into this clip, I had done a full circle of the main area of the town and found no one. So a little bit into this clip, I'm still walking and I'm just like, God damn it, the plot's happening again. Because like this is kind of like one of those mainstays of Fractured Thrones is that whenever these kind of larger sorts of plots events happen, they're all very heavily tied into these larger life-threatening situations that end up usually getting resolved by combat. So in this case, basically the entire player cast was sent outside to the lake because there were some creatures there and there was some like magic stuff. So there was an all call for the NPCs, and then all of the GMs were over there as well. So at some point, I had done my circles, and there was no one. There was actually no one in the town. The main central core area of the roleplay, no one was there. And being a character that could not participate in the combat because it was just not what my character was designed to do. He's not going to go risk his life for literally nothing. He's just working on some, metal crafts. He just walks outside and everyone's gone. So I have the clip of me walking through the town just like Christos, no. Ladia, no. Any merchants in the market in the dead of the afternoon? No. No one was there, and it kind of speaks to this again, the idea of like violence works and is easy, but it alienates anything that isn't designed to be able to handle violence, and that leads to a lot of role plays. One thing that I have noticed, this is obviously not just restricted to role plays like Fractured Thrones. Anything that uses combat as a primary vessel for storytelling tends to also include characters that are almost always geared to be able to handle combat in a less than super stressful sort of capacity. Like most characters will end up being either capable of combat or more willing to conduct it, which also, if we're looking back at design, comes very easily from the very common edges and flaws system, because the most low-hanging fruit possible with edges and flaws, that tends to be the first thing that people think about is, okay, well, how can I use this to advantage or disadvantage my character in situations where they would otherwise be threatened? And that usually comes in the form of being good at something related to combat, right? I'm good with a two-handed sword. I trip over things easily, and this might disadvantage me in a fight. That kind of stuff. So overall, it is definitely a direction that I have seen a lot of role plays move in. That combat absolutely can be a really valuable vessel for serious dramatic moments and kind of driving really high urgency. Absolutely, that is absolutely a thing. But what deserves to be noticed quite a bit is that this same sort of consideration for what combat actually does needs to be thought about in the design as well, and to understand whether or not it is crucial for characters to have to engage in it to actually do anything in the roleplay. Not trying not to think of it as like a huge dichotomy, but it really is one of those life-threatening things that most people don't engage in. That if you think of a character as like a normal person in their day-to-day life, most people aren't continually, constantly engaging in things that would threaten their life. If you as a normal person aren't specifically looking for ways to get excitement out of going out to war zones or whatever, right? Most people are not like that. So obviously characters are narrative devices. So there is a bit of like a grain of salt that comes with this as well. But it really is worth considering. You know, how does this character exist apart from that? How do we kind of untie from that need for lethal threat, and how do we tell stories that don't necessarily need to include that? Uh, that's what we're trying to aim for. That is absolutely what we're trying to aim for here. That being said, I actually really have to go to the bathroom. Stellan, if you could take the
Absolutely. I
yeah.
have I have some examples to talk about, so I can fill the air for quite some time. Uh, I'll start with the one that I think you know about, to and because I really want to talk about the other one. Um, all right, so yeah, I wanted to talk about and maybe like evidence like a couple of moments that kind of like I've had or seen in role plays that I thought were like really cool examples of conflict. And I'll start with I guess one of my favorite roleplay scenarios on ERS 2.0. It's a pretty great kind of short form roleplay, parlor LARP, if you will, that is about it's a sort of near future sci-fi. You're on a colony ship, like trying to colonize a different planet, and you are playing these 6 delegates aboard the ship that represent the different guilds from the Earth. And these 6 delegates are supposed to be, they're the number one people for the job in their own department. So, for example, you have the science guild, you have the engineering guild, but you also had the administrative guild and the spiritual guild, which personally I find the most interesting. The fact that there was a spiritual guild. And the idea was that each of these characters has like a different sort of opinion on life, but they also have different skills, right? Which is based on what guild they're in. And in this role play, you are put in a stressful situation, and you have to make a hard decision in a set amount of time. Uh, at the at the threat of death, though I suppose it's not a combat situation, but I suppose you still have the threat of dying to motivate you. You're in a really stressful situation. You don't have a lot of time, and you have to make this hard decision. And because the characters, right, the characters are by design split on kind of their philosophies, and they're also split on like what they know about, you get some really interesting discussions, and you get some really interesting compromises taking place. um, Characters usually start off being unable to reach a consensus, unable to agree, but by the end you have some very interesting things happen. My favorite running of Oniera 2.0 had I think the it's my favorite because usually, usually you have the sort of science and engineering guild members. Usually, you kind of have them take over the argument. Use facts and logic to kind of control the argument, and you have the other guilds kind of usually feel unprepared to tackle these arguments. But in this one, um, we had the spiritual guild representative kind of take over a bit, and you had all 6 representatives um, kind of sitting together and questioning if their souls would be damned with the decision that they were about to make. And that was kind of like the end, like emotional moment of the role play, was like they were getting prepared to take this risk that could potentially kill everybody on board, and they were consulting with the spiritual guild leader as to whether or not their souls would be damned for all eternity. And like, I'm just sitting there, I'm just like, mwah, this is like beautiful drama. This is fantastic. I have never seen something like that happen before. Um, I always root for the spiritual and cultural guild whenever that happens, because once again, it's like almost always dominated by the in order, the science and engineering, and then maybe the agriculture guild. Usually they're the ones where it's like, oh, you need us more because if you don't have us, you're not gonna have enough food, you're not gonna have enough water, we're all gonna die anyway. But like, I just really love when you kind of get these different and interesting takes and different and interesting kind of like arguments that arise. Um, that's really what the exploration is all about. Um, so yeah, on AR 2.0, definitely one of my favorite role plays there. Um, I'll just keep talking about scenario one stuff. Uh, I didn't write On Air 2.0. I also didn't write Here's My Power Button. Fantastic LARP by Brody Atwater. Um, that one has the main conflict of that role play is very personal, and it's between um, essentially you have half the players playing consumers. They're just normal people who are being brought in for a consumer like testing study thing. I'm not really sure how to describe it. It's like a consumer testing. The other half of the players are playing new fancy general intelligence AI that just got invented, and there is a heavy power dynamic in this role play because the consumers have the power at any not at any time, but periodically throughout the role play, the consumers have the power to reset their AI back to factory default if they're unhappy with them. You really get into kind of like the themes of, what does it mean? What does it even mean to be human? Am I alive if, like, my consumer is just allowed to wipe me, right? Wipe my personality, everything that I know, and starting again. And this is the source of conflict in this case, right? That power dynamic, um, that kind of unfair control that the consumer players have over the AI is generally the main source of conflict. Um, you very often have like the AI finding out that they can get reset and, being really upset because, I mean, wouldn't you be really upset if like somebody had that much power over you? And sometimes you have like the consumers, right? The consumers might find out and be like, actually, this is pretty messed up. Let's not do this. But then, then the sales representative, the consumer researcher tries their best to convince you that actually it's fine because they're not people. Um, and sometimes you get characters that agree with that, and sometimes you get characters that don't. Um, Really recently, it was very interesting. Really recently, I forget who it was, but we had somebody play an AI who was totally on board with their place, basically. Um, which is really funny because um, when we first ran Here's My Power Button, this was before kind of AI was making its rounds. We actually ran it before ChatGPT was a thing. Um, and at that time, it was all about, AI uprising. The AI are going to are basically like humans, and they're going to, be very upset about the situation that they put in. And but then recently, more recently, we had somebody play an AI who was just much more robotic, much more like the sort of, robot tropes that you would expect to see. Um, and they were like, yeah, I'm an AI. I'm not a person, and you should reset me. And that was also really interesting. And I think that's kind of telling of the sort of change, or Here's My Power Button, is that conflict there is really telling of the sort of change of opinions that people, like actual people like outside the roleplay, have about the AI. Um, in this case, conflict is, I think, revealing a bit about not just the characters, but about the people playing them as well. Um, all right. I don't know if Solus is back yet.
I'm back.
I will. Ah, fantastic! Because I was trying to stall for time for my last example because I don't know if you've I don't know if I've talked to you. I've definitely complained to you about this event, but I don't think I've gushed to you about it because
Okay.
there was a sort of moment in gang role play that I felt was like really good on the conflict, and it's one of those like accidental genius moments in gang role play. This was not planned. This was entirely like something that just happened, right? But I think that the sort of accidental genius is important to pay attention to.
Mhm.
Very early in gang roleplay, we had a sort of split. We had a sort of split in the characters, where one of the characters just came back from a mission and just went up and straight up shot the gang leader. Like they just shot him in the chest, and that caused a sort of mini civil war to happen. I say mini because the sort of the rebel faction was in the lore of the world was far too small to have a chance at like taking out the larger gang, which was the largest gang in the city. But you essentially had characters kind of split up, and we ended up with two kind of competing gangs. um that was like one of the first moments in the role play, very early on. But that's not what I wanted to talk about. um there was a single instance of like 40 versus 40 PvP in this role play. Um, I've definitely complained to you about it in the past because, the PvP was pretty bad. We paused the role play every 30 seconds.
Ah, this
It
one.
was not very enjoyable, in my opinion. However, the situation surrounding that event was really interesting, in my opinion. A lot of these characters knew each other from the time before the two gangs split. And this um, led to what I think was definitely the core tension of gang roleplay at the time, was that you essentially had, two gangs that were, on the surface against each other, but, in a lot of the characters, like, between these two gangs that, barely had any communication nowadays. A lot of them still knew each other from back in the day when, before the split happened. Um, in the lead up to in the lead up to this attack, the attack was actually ordered by the big gang boss. Um, very few people on the Whisperers at the time, which was the gang that was on the offensive. Very few people from Whisperers at the time actually wanted to attack the Fallen. Very few of them actually wanted to because we had known a lot of those characters, and it was kind of like an open secret by that point that we were secretly working together. Um, however, um, what was really, really interesting to me is that the longer this roleplay went on, the longer longer the conflict went on, we had like more and more people, join the roleplay slowly over time. We had more and more people make characters who weren't there, right? The role players were there when the split happened, but like the characters weren't there when the split happened. So you had more and more people, more and more characters kind of entering the Whispers. And as time went on, the the original kind of like enemies but secretly friends dynamic like started to shift, and like more and more people were like really on the let's fight the Fallen, right? And you had the kind of the old guard of the Whisperers like really trying to be like, no, actually secretly we're friends. But eventually that failed, right? Eventually that kind of fell through, and it was really hard to get like kind of characters who just hadn't been there. Like it had been months, right? It was really hard. It had been months since split, and it was really hard to get the characters who had zero stake in that, like, that like family like relationship with the Fallen to not be like, hey, yeah, let's just attack them and crush them, right? And I found that really interesting. Um, During that 40 versus 40 PvP scenario, myself, my character, and another character that I was close with, we kind of were just there. We were literally just like walking around and like surveying the surveying the place, right? Everybody else was over, in the corner, fighting, having their standoff, and we were kind of just like walking around and like talking and like and because our characters and a lot of the characters there didn't actually want to fight the Fallen, and I felt that was a very interesting conflict to be in of like um softly rebelling against the gang leadership. I wish we could have explored it more because that's why I say it was accidental genius and not planned. It's because the roleplay at that point was kind of sort of basically there wasn't really room to explore that. It was a bit more on rails than would have allowed for that sort of exploration. Wasn't entirely on rails, but it was a bit more on rails than would have allowed for that exploration.
Right. Yeah, you definitely didn't talk about this one before, but I am personally
Mhm.
such a huge fan of inner faction conflict.
Oh, it
Right.
was so good. It was so good.
Yeah. We
Kind of like sneaking out, like while you're not supposed to talk to the enemy, like sneaking out to go and like hang out with your best friend at the arcade, right? And then getting into trouble for it later, and then your boss is like, I'm looking at you, I know, but we have to keep up appearances. That was great. I ate that up. It was fantastic.
it is I like it. It's nuance.
Mhm.
Right. Uh we may have talked about factions before on this podcast, and if we haven't, we definitely should. But I think one thing that tends to happen with factions quite a bit is this sort of partitioning that
Mhm.
like the belief tends toward like because I'm a part of this faction, the everything that I do is against the other faction that is against this one. And realistically, factions are made to direct thematic perspectives to create these bases on which characters can kind of build and identify where they sit kind of on the thematic spectrum. But characters and people are complex and can conflict inside of factions and can uh, find positive relationships within other factions that they would normally be against. And those kind of things makes for some very interesting conflicts. It's like
Mhm.
even if you're just looking kind of on an operational perspective, right? Like, say you're like part of like a police department, and like, your chief is just like, we got to meet up with these gang leaders, and then like the younger guy who just joined the force is like, why aren't we gonna like capture him or something? And it's like, no, we gotta figure out some ends somehow, and these are our best contacts. You need contacts in dark places, and suddenly like the like very baseline law versus criminal sort of divide, that partition there has just been breached, right? Because
Mhm.
now you effectively created a bridge between the two that operate under some sort of context, and then you've also got this like little conflict between like the person who's been there long enough to like recognize what needs to be done and the new guy who has this like rose tinted lens on what it is that he's gotten himself into, and suddenly, several conflicts just spread out of nowhere.
Mhm. Oh
So
yeah, no, absolutely. I would agree that factions are definitely at their best when on the surface, right? On the surface, they're very distinct, but like there is some mixing between the people and the ideologies, right? That's when factions are really at their best, is when characters can kind of like fall into or at least interact with multiple of them. Um, it's not it ceases to be just us versus them. Us versus them can work. There are certainly like certain scenarios that I think would very much want the like if you're exploring the us versus them mentality, right? If that's what your role play is about, for example, then like um, then in that case, it might be it might make sense to kind of have that like very clean split. But even then, it's kind of like I think factions are at their best when you have a just a light mixing, right,
Mhm.
between the different factions.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about like conflict and dramatic structure and like what that all means. So like one thing I feel we haven't like done enough of is like how do we do it? Right? As the players,
Yeah.
like we've got this like plot happening and there's things happening around us that evidence things that evidence perspectives on the plot and ways that we can kind of engage with it and kind of create opinions about it. But how do we create conflict as players?
Well,
Right.
step number one, right? Step number one is, as always, to be on the same page, right? In order to like actually create conflict in a way that's not accidental, you need to, both as players and as staff of the role play, kind of understand what the themes are, what like the common themes are that you're going for. And what you want is you want pretty much all your characters to have at least some amount of opinion on the main themes of the roleplay, right? Characters don't need to have opinions on everything, right? There are certainly characters, right? As I mentioned, right? I mentioned the character that I was playing in Metaverse. There are some characters that aren't going to be able to engage with certain themes, some characters that aren't going to be able to engage in certain conflicts. But if you understand what the themes of your roleplay are, then having conflict is as easy as essentially requiring that all the characters in this roleplay have opinions about these themes. Well, okay, I say as easy as, but the additional requirement is that it's not all the same opinion, right?
Mm-hmm.
If it's all the same opinion, then you're not going to get a conflict. But
Yep.
as long as you have at least a couple of different opinions, which I mean, you're bound to get because different characters are different people, then that is already going to be baseline enough to create conflict. Now that's enough. I suppose we can also talk about like how to heighten that conflict
Right.
a little bit.
So I like to believe I do pretty good with this because this is like one of my focuses as a player. So I want to speak on as much as I can. So by like having that perspective of like what that shared thematic understanding is and how players conflict or sorry how characters conflict with each other on those sorts of thematic perspectives, then as a player you end up finding kind of the holes in that, right? You look at kind of ways that those perspectives can be challenged, whether it's your own character or someone else's character, and you kind of poke at that a little bit, right? One thing that we like to one thing we like to say is that there's no absolute good or evil, right? Because roleplay is very interesting in that it is a medium where you're not strictly encapsulating everything within a single perspective. Most media is like you have a book and you're reading the book and you're reading the book from the perspective of whoever the story's about. And then you derive your protagonist and antagonist and such from there. You have your morality based on the perspective of the story, etc. Same with like movies and such. You always see it from a perspective, right? With a roleplay at a very large, kind of a big picture point of view, hawk's eye sort of view. You don't have that. You have a wide array of characters that believe different things, that conflict with each other on different things, and you only really get a protagonist and antagonist when you zoom in on one of those perspectives, and you finally kind of embody one of those characters, and you think, okay, this character is their own protagonist, right? They are the kind of focus of their story, and whoever differs, whoever conflicts with them and is against their point of view in some way is more or less antagonistic to them. So when we kind of think in that really broad sort of perspective, we can think, how do those differences happen? And then to once again reiterate, the ones that are against it are not necessarily evil, although the character may think so. But there's a reason why they believe the things that they do, the reasons why they are the way that they are, or they act the way that they do. One kind of core example, maybe, the theoretical state of Neon Divide. I will use this as an example where part of the setting is that there are synthetic characters, which, as you would expect, are basically robots with some level of individual operation. Usually they are owned by someone. So they have like an operator or an owner of some sort who actually is the one with rights, since themselves don't really have any rights. And there's like this kind of tertiary thing about like awakening or whatever, but like not even worrying about that. Let's assume a synthetic character is just a synthetic character. The ways that conflicts could kind of arise around that, very, very tangentially, is that by recognizing that there are sorts of these themes about basic rights surrounding these synthetic characters and the way that they are perceived, that you, as someone who's as a character who recognizes this is the state of the world and this is the state of these characters, that you can kind of give that sort of roleplay to them, because that's essentially what they've signed up for, right? So say, for example, you are a restaurant owner. You're maybe behind the counter, and a synth walks up and is trying to buy some food, and then you can say, sure, can I? Is your owner present? Small source of conflict there, right? Because this synth is now, first of all, inconvenienced because they tried to do something on their own, and secondly, if their owner isn't present, what's going to happen, right? There's risk here. This creates a conflict for the character, which is a small one, right? It's a very little nuanced kind of interaction of like, 4 words. Is your owner present? But like the implications there are pretty massive, because it reinforces what the synth is in the setting. It kind of affirms that like this synth either should not be here without someone accompanying them, or perhaps this person does not trust the synth walking around on their own, even if they're not necessarily supposed to be accompanied by anyone. So it becomes this kind of question for the synth of like, well, is this a potentially risky situation? What do I do? Synth has to make a decision. If they, they could decide to lie. They can decide to defy something. They can decide to, hang their head low and just turn back around and then come back, or later with some other pretense or something. But what happens afterward then evidences something about the synth character, right? And this is kind of what we mean when we look at the very last bold text of this paragraph that I'm referencing right now with the embrace conflict principle, is that drama is conflict, and heightening conflict is one of the most effective forms of play to lift. because that affirmation for that player, for the synth character, if they are like signing up to be the like, you know, not a real citizen owned by someone else kind of vibe, and someone else doing that is like awesome, right? That is someone else uh, effectively needs to show that for that to happen, right? In the same vein that a charismatic character is only charismatic by how others treat them. Uh, Conflicts that are embedded within a setting only exist um, when they are fulfilled or presented by the other characters within the setting that would be involved with it.
I I suppose I wanted to I guess this is like one step back. You were talking about like evil and like absolute evil.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to talk about that a little bit more. And expand on it a little bit because like I won't even talk about roleplay here. I'll just talk about like general media here and kind of like stories, because at the end of the day that's kind of what we're doing here in roleplay land is telling stories together. And I think like the point of like having the absolute evil is right, like the point of having like an absolute evil in media is usually to like give an excuse almost for your protagonists to be together, right? Because like despite their differences, the absolute evil is always worse, and so they're going to work together to stop it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's more of like in my opinion, it usually feels like a plot contrivance more than anything. And as far as like plot contrivance goes, I'll talk quickly here about Lord of the Rings. I think I think honestly like Tolkien-esque fantasy has had like saying a very large impact in like the cultural like imagining of like fantasy is, I think that's an understatement. Like it's just kind of like a huge outsized impact into like how people think about and consume fantasy. And like of course you have Lord of the Rings. I am not no expert on the series, but I've watched the movie, I've read the book. um you have like Sauron off in Mordor, off in the distance, and I believe you can really easily you know say that character is a force of absolute evil. um Even in Lord of the Rings, coincidentally, Lord of the Rings is not about fighting Sauron. At no point do any of the characters, talk to or interact with or like do anything with the guy, right? He's just off in the distance, right? He's a plot contrivance. Um, the things that a lot of the characters usually struggle with are with themselves, kind of like the temptations from the One Ring. There's a lot of like internal struggles going on with those characters, and kind of like they're like usually working together, but like they occasionally kind of get tempted to in one way or another, and kind of like that's kind of like the character kind of development that you see. um there's a lot of like resisting or like falling to temptation,
Mm-hmm.
um so like even there, even with the absolute evil, you still kind of get that sort of conflict being evidenced. What I think is far more dangerous than having an absolute evil in your roleplay, because at the end of the day, absolute evil is just plot contrivance. What I think is far more dangerous is assuming that the players are the absolute good, um, and that everybody's on the same page, and like we're fighting the evil and we're the absolute good. That I think is far more dangerous. In pretty much any like media that I can think of, even when there is an absolute evil, you usually get like that one episode or that like one arc where like you have the character and they like evidence like some flaw or some vice of this character, right? You have that the one episode that's dedicated to the character kind of growing over their flaws, right? And you can't do that if you assume that, your protagonists are absolutely good. You can't do that. Um, it kind of, it kind of becomes silly at that point. And I think for role play, having that absolute good is I think far more dangerous than having an absolute evil. Though I think, having the absolute evil also gets, in my opinion, gets boring after a while. But I think you can do it if you view it for what it really is. And having, your big bad that's absolutely evil and there's nothing you can do about it is a plot contrivance to get the characters on the same page, right? Get them together and talking and working together. That's really all it is.
It's also fair to say, like, having a pure evil can also just be a stand-in for a character's internal struggle that they have to overcome the pure evil, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you find a lot of times that uh, the protagonist winning the final conflict against the big bad tends to come along after some major point of growth or revelation that the protagonist goes through to effectively overcome what is their internal struggle, and that kind of just becomes like, well, this story
Mm-hmm.
really isn't about just overcoming the big bad, right? It's about the protagonist kind of growing through this sort of struggle and being better from it,
Mm-hmm.
and then them being better means they are more narratively ready to encounter this threat, and it's just kind of
Mm-hmm.
like the narrative stand-in, I guess. Uh,
Yeah, the closest I think I can think of to like absolute good in media is and I think what I think a lot of a lot of role plays that I'm aware of at least are patterned after is kind of like a shonen anime. The main like
mm,
drive like plot force that's driving shonen anime is you have your protagonist. They're just like the coolest, people, right? You have your protagonist. They're just the coolest. They're just the best. And what essentially shonen anime plays with is you take your protagonist and you put them in like the worst situation imaginable. You put them against an opponent, or you put them in like a situation where you're just like, oh, there's no way this character is going to come out the other side, right? Like they're either going to lose, or they're going to compromise on their morals, or like, something's going to happen to them, right? You put them in this like really bad situation. And then the game of the shonen anime is like you're sitting there in the audience where you're like, okay, so how are they going to make it out this time, right? And that's kind of like the story of shonen anime is the protagonist's in a bad spot. You know they're going to succeed, right? You know they have plot armor, but how are they going to overcome this force? And I think a lot of role plays are kind of like patterned after this discovery, or this kind of process where you have your characters, you put them in a bad situation, and the main interaction is, well, we don't know exactly how, but how do these players overcome this bad situation?
mm.
Um, I mean, I'm not going to, shonen anime is certainly very popular. I'm not about to say that like it's bad or anything. Um, what it definitely is though is very one note and very repetitive, because like it's the same thing every time, right? You take the protagonist, put them in a situation, how do they make it out? You know they're going to make it out, and then the next time you're back to square one, nothing's happened. The character is still just as flawless and just as pristine as they were before the conflict happened, right? So I'm certainly not going to call it bad, because I have to take a look at it. I know a lot of people enjoy that sort of storytelling, which is enough for me to say that it's valid, right? What I will definitely form an opinion on though is that it's definitely very one note, and you kind of end up telling the same story over and over and over and over again. And
Hmm.
once again, as somebody who likes exploration, as somebody who likes, you know, different things, it does eventually, kind of bore me. That's basically my opinion on absolute good. Is I feel like having that absolute good in your role play, to me, makes it feel like a shonen anime where it becomes very one note after a certain amount of time. Right? You're telling the same story over and over and over again.
I can't say how many times that I've heard in the scope of like thinking of like NPC activity, right? Like if you're signing up to be an NPC for a mission or some sort of like encounter against the players, that this phrase gets kind of passed around. The players will always win anyways, right? And it's a point of both frustration and kind of acceptance, I think, for a lot of people that uh, that I think there is a understanding that this makes for a lot of complacency, that like because the players know that they will succeed in a given scenario, that it doesn't really matter what happens in the middle. And on the other end, it makes it very unsatisfying if the goal is to explore the conflict a little bit more, which I think a lot of people really
Mhm.
want to do. I have, I think, over time recognized, and I actually want to like talk to people a lot more about this. So like people that I
Yeah.
haven't polled in a while about this. That like I want to understand more of how people would want to address these sorts of situations, and like would they want this thing to be explored more and not resolved, because we
Hmm.
over here in Couchform land, we enjoy exploring things. We enjoy having a conflict and not necessarily just seeking to resolve it, but like seeing what that conflict means and then kind of exploring the nuances of it, and seeing the value in it and kind of pushing and poking at different things within it. We find that very interesting. Uh, I am very curious to see what the same
Hmm.
players that have kind of lamented about that sort of structure would also say about that. I actually might that might be my next thought in pulling some thoughts across the RP community nowadays. I like doing that. It's very fun.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess now that we're talking about this, I just remember just unlocked the memory of like a thing. I think I think the sort of shonen anime style is also like in conflict with what a lot of people do like doing, because from what I can tell, we have a lot of role players who love like having their characters like have some sort of like flaw, and kind of like exploring that in safety with their like close knit group of friends, right? But like a big thing that drives the sort of shonen anime is the fact that the characters come out the other side spotless, right? So like if you have characters that don't come out the other side spotless, then having that like loop of like, oh, the players always win and like they're the heroes does kind of get a bit weird. Essentially, like it gets a bit weird, and you end up with like some situations where like the characters do some like really heinous stuff, and like but they're still supposed to be the heroes, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
um and I feel like this is that conflict between role players who kind of like want to do some like light exploration of like characters falling to their vices, but in a role play that's following the shonen anime loop where the characters are supposed to be the heroes and supposed to come out the other side spotless, but they're not coming out the other side spotless. And yeah, so you get in this weird situation sometimes where you have characters that like do some like really messed up stuff, and like they're supposed to be the heroes. Um, and so those two like sort of storytelling like mediums don't really work very well together. That being said, like this does remind me of a hypothetical role play that was pitched Way Back When by Ava Nera. I'll read the short description here. As this was like a hypothetical example of like an all combat badass roleplay. And anyway, here it is. Here at Badass Endeavors, we're adrenaline addicts. If it isn't going to kill you, it's not worth our time. Badass Endeavors is a small group of battle-hardened comrades barely scraping by on ridiculous A-team style adventures and using crazy, over-the-top pyrotechnics to open every bloody door they walk through. Well, the doors will certainly be bloody after the pyrotechnics at least. We focus on aggressive, over-the-top combat scenarios. Participants are encouraged to embrace the rule of cool, and when you're back at base after a hard-fought mission, you can brag to all your friends who are on the night watch about how much cooler you were than them, and hope that when it's their turn next week, they won't one-up you. That description right there, right? Like that's the shonen roleplay, right? That kind of like hits that we're cool, we're badass. And I feel like a roleplay that would kind of like really go all in on that would really appeal to some people. And I think it would appeal to the crowd who enjoys that thing more than the sort of half and half, you know? The one where you're kind of sort of the heroes, but also you're kind of sort of not sometimes, you know? It's just a different type of story. It's just a different type of story that accomplishes a different type of thing.
Yeah, yeah. I would even say like that very almost definitely fits under Couchform, right? Because it is the theming is clear, right? The theming is extremely clear.
Yeah.
Because it's made obvious within the pitch that it is meant to be this kind of over the top, kind of adrenaline seeking sort of crazy action, and that is exactly what is used as a vessel, ideally for the actual roleplay itself. It's like exactly what they're aiming for, and stating that is like, yeah, that's good, right?
Even that had some conflict evidence in the description, though. So constantly, one-upping each other, right?
Yep.
And just be the coolest dude that you can possibly be, you know. That's even Badass Endeavors has a source of conflict right there, you know.
Twitch instant action that report. I wonder. I was the one that banned it immediately, so that was me. I'm the fast one.
Wow.
Yes, that was me. I banned that bot. They actually, I need to set a higher follow limit time for chatting. It seems like they just took advantage of that. Reaction to report. Oh my god, no, that's crazy. Actually, good job, Twitch. So I actually wanted to speak on that previous point of like the ever present hero, right? Because this was also one of those kind of unspoken things about Fraction Thrones that I very heavily struggled with. In that, over time, it became very evident that there were certain players doing very heinous things that in a lot of ways be either morally questionable or within the setting actually just dangerous or against the law or would normally result in some sort of consequence to their character, and that they were kind of allowed to do that because the story had to go a certain way and everything would kind of lean in toward making that happen. What this ended up doing was that it ended up with the roleplay starting with a premise that the players are all playing peasants that will not necessarily have an impact on the world around them, to a story about how the peasants overcame some of the most dire situations possible and came out of it relatively scathed but still healthy. And they do that over and over and over. And I think for me, where it became very evident that this is a thing that can happen was when it started being referenced in character. Um, that it kind of just dawned on me that like the story of the peasants on the flank of this major fight is now circulating as like an in character story, and I have just heard it in the world as my character, and now I have to process it as the player. Like, this is what I'm surrounded by. The story is just so different now, and at that point, you might as well call it a different roleplay. That when the theming changes that much, I always have the criticism that the moment you change the theming in a very significant way, you are effectively playing a different roleplay. I don't think there's a point at which you have the exact same roleplay embodying such contrasting themes, because realistically, what you start with there with the kind of peasant unable to affect the world around them is that they are generally going to be a victim of consequence and of dark circumstances, hence the dark fantasy sort of genre. And that is far, far, far different from the story where the peasants band together and overcome all the obstacles before them and heroically charge through the situations in front. Those are such different stories, and at that point are different role plays.
Yeah, and like if you find your character, right? If you find your like sort of like gritty realism character in the heroic storyline, that can feel a bit weird. I don't know. I find that a bit weird. And like vice versa, right? If you find your like anime protagonist, your spotless anime protagonist in the gritty realism story, that's also a bit weird, you know, and out of place. Not to say that like you can't play with that a little bit, but only a little bit, really, right? Like it's just an entirely different type of like storytelling. Um, and the kind of further you kind of stretch that, the more it just the more it just kind of the story essentially eventually forces you to interact with it in a certain way. Um, yeah.
I'm just So actually, you know what? I'm curious. What is your favorite style of conflict?
um, that is a great question. I suppose I'm not entirely sure, in the sense of there are some types of conflicts which I want to which I still want to explore, but my goodness, I am a sucker for the internal conflicts. I personally am a sucker for that, and like I usually play very type 2 characters. Even the like the on the surface, even the ones that kind of look like shitposts usually are struggling with some like internal or like fighting some internal battle. I just like don't think I've managed to play a character that has been like fully confident in themselves and like at peace with themselves. So I think I'll probably have to say that one's probably my favorite. Um,
You gotta play a Rowan, right? He was.
yeah,
God. Sorry, go on.
yeah, I don't know. It's just like I am kind of a sucker for those kind of internal dilemmas. Though I should probably, now that I'm talking about it, I should probably get around to playing a character that, you know, is at peace with themselves, is kind of confident in what they believe in.
Mhm.
And that question, I think that would also give me maybe a bit more of a perspective on that sort of on that sort of character.
Having played that sort of character, I will say it is difficult. And the reason I say that is because uh, having an internal conflict is a very good driver for a story. At the
Hmm.
very least, you have some sort of thematic driver to base your interactions with everyone else around. That being said, I actually tend toward doing that. Uh, by which I mean not, or but sorry, by which I mean having a character that's at peace with themselves. Because I mentioned this before in I think the second episode of the podcast
Hmm.
that I really enjoy playing with status. I enjoy
Hmm.
building characters and their own conflicts through status. So if I were to bring up the example of Rowan, uh, B is a character that was absolutely at peace with his situation and himself and how he viewed the world. And that was just his own perspective. And he was totally fine with that. The conflict came around when the differences in status within the setting conflicted with his current position in the world. And displacing him from that created this sort of ever present tension that he is not home, he is not where he should be, he needs to go back, but he can't. So how does he reconcile where he is now? And in a lot of ways, like I want to gush so much about this character because I feel like I feel like this is the character I did the best with because not only were they kind of just a dude from where they came from, that I really
Hmm.
didn't need to put too much more effort into like differentiating them in any way, but like the way that they were presented with like this very bare bones sort of issue created not only this really good internal conflict for me to play with, but it also his own existence, just him being around, was itself a conflict for a lot of characters in a certain way because a lot of the characters within Worlds Apart were kind of struggling with this notion of how to push for free will in a setting that normally suppresses it, right? How to kind of navigate that, and having a very strong representation of that exact establishment and culture in Rowan, who was effectively all in on that sort of mindset and generally well-meaning. This is like, you have found issue with a certain like way of demographic things. Like you've decided, I need to act on this somehow. And then like the nice old lady down the street that you have been friends with your entire childhood growing up, and now you're like a functioning adult and all, it suddenly evidences that perspective that you have just decided you're against. Like, what do you do? Right? It creates this sort of like interesting conflict where like people have to figure out, how do I broach this topic? Is this do I want to like do I want to interrupt this guy's like choice of living for my own ideals? Like, is it worth it? Is how much do I actually believe in this? And is this actually good if he benefited from it? If someone like that benefited from it? So basically, just me walking around being like the nice deer man. I feel like that actually created a lot of conflicts on its own, which I thought was really
Hmm.
cool, and I think a lot of people tended to play with that quite a bit. Where sure there were a disproportionately large amount of characters that were kind of pushing against the norm in the setting to kind of establish this sort of free will is better kind of vibe. Uh, but I also found that a lot of those players were very interested in like seeing that my character was kind of on the other side and being like, okay, I really have to figure out how to navigate this. I
Hmm.
really have to figure out like what kind of values that that this character embodies, and how to like help them. There was a lot of like, I need to help this character when he was already in like what he believed to be a good state, which again was another conflict, right? If you're a person who doesn't believe they need to be helped and someone else thinks you do, that alone is a conflict. What does that mean about your own situation and how you see it, right? Creates
I
more
have
friction.
I have two questions for you. Speaking of Rowan and like having played that character that is confident in themselves, because I haven't, and I'm interested.
Sure.
So, question one, um, did you feel like while playing Rowan, did you feel like you mentioned that you're kind of just walking around being the nice deer man? Did you feel like you had to be the nice deer man, like specifically the nice deer man? Was that something that you like felt that you had to be, or um
Not necessarily. I think it definitely added a sort of dimension to the consideration of that character, that like he was generally well-meaning.
mhm.
That being said, I did from time to time inject a little fantasy racism into just the way that Rowan conducted himself, because
Mhm.
realistically, a large part of the perspective of his culture would have been that like the beastkin and those that are pushing for this like extreme form of free will and self-determination are themselves kind of fundamental enemies of the empire, and thus are portrayed in this kind of propagandistic way as like these evil forces, right? These like extremists and such and such. And I figured Rowan would have kind of grown up uh, with that understanding of these different kinds of people, that he would just kind of very casually say some potentially concerning things about
Mhm.
how they conduct themselves, and those would kind of be said out in the open enough that like people would just kind of tilt their head like, wait, what did you say? And it's just like, yeah,
Uh-huh.
that's just the truth, right? And it wasn't necessarily like heavily challenged, but what I tried to do was like make it clear that it isn't necessary that he's just the nice deer man. What was necessary, I think, in that context was to show that he was just a person, and the way that he lived his life was good for him. And in a lot of ways, I think that that is something that does not exist very much at all in roleplay. I realize that a lot of players will try to approach a current state of things from an outside perspective. And while I did kind of do that with having Rowan come from the vassal lands on the opposite side of the empire, what I did try to do was establish that what he is and the way he conducts himself is the result of a lived experience and is integrated with that lived experience. Whereas I find a lot of players will tend to separate from that quite a bit, and say something happened within lived experience that means my perspective is different and my character's perspective is unique from that because they are now separate and now they are here. Which is why I really enjoy kind of, even if the character isn't nice, I would use Kidos as an example from Fractured Thrones, that what is important in those sort of circumstances is that the character represents the lived experience and is not necessarily because Kidos was an asshole, right? This guy was a dick. He was prideful. He treated people like less than himself. But the reason why he did that was because he had lived under this kind of he lived within this shadow of the councilman who was his father, with everyone around him kind of expecting these greater and greater and greater things, to the point where he lived in this constant need to validate that he is good enough and that everyone else around him is seeking that from him. So he had this sort of like very cut and dry way of talking to people and seeking things from people because he had this like obsessive desire to do better and to get the mission done and to do as much good for his people as possible. And I feel like that, while it didn't land very well in the role play, to me that felt like a really good conflict as well. And I think it's it's definitely harder to make that work unless you've kind of like communicated that across like the player base that like this is the way my character is, uh, and this is kind of what I'm going for. But I find that to be a very similar consideration in that when you do make a character that is that sort of confident in themselves, that it is because they have lived that way. And that's what informs it. Very long-winded answer, but hope that rounds up the thought.
Yeah, no. I mean, so first of all, as a reason I ask is because as a GM in a project, as GM of Worlds Apart, I can honestly admit I have no idea how it was like to be in the role play. So like I'm always interested in hearing people's perspectives on what it was like to be in the role play. Also, I was also kind of like thinking about the janitor character, the metaverse character that I wasn't able to play because that would have been that like self-confident character. I just felt like I couldn't play them in that space. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it was like tough to. I was unable to like think of a way to play that character in the space without like playing a different character. So I was like interested in hearing how you felt about that. Um, I'll have to think about that a bit more, but I do have a second question, and that's this is also as a person who has never played that kind of sort of self-confident character. What I kind of like envision as like a potential problem with playing that sort of character is one of the reasons that I like having a internal conflict with my characters is because it essentially kind of like makes your character like a bit more independent. Like you can still with an internal conflict, you can still absolutely like role play with other characters just as if just as if you're basically an internal conflict doesn't stop you from role playing with other characters, but what it does definitely allow you to do is kind of like take a step back and like role play with yourself, right? Like that's like one of the big interesting parts of like internal conflicts to me is like that sort of like internal like thought process that you can have like a in character thought process going on, and you can totally have that like during a conversation with another character. You can also have that when I don't know, you're just like walking from point A to point B all alone, nobody there, and you can still like kind of keep yourself entertained with that. So that would be my second question is like I guess like how is that? How is that how is it playing this sort of self-confident character when you just happen to be on your own?
I think. Hmm, I think there is an unspoken assumption here.
I
That
might have one. I
yes,
might have an
yeah. I'm gonna surface it and I'll see what you think about it.
all right.
So I think the unspoken assumption here is that the self-confident character does not have an internal conflict to internally monologue on. That's what I think
Okay.
is kind of behind
I
this.
suppose, like in that sense, I suppose in that sense, as a rephrasing of my question, what is that internal conflict then?
Anything.
Or what sort of form does that take when when you are like you feel like you know what's going on and you feel like you have things figured out? What form does that internal conflict take? Because maybe I feel like I'm just not being creative enough here. So this like that's why I'm wondering.
So I can I guess that depends, right? I hate using that depends because it very much is a non-answer, but I
Sure,
will.
like
I'll dive into both these examples. I'll dive into both of
go
them.
ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So I posit that both Kidos and Rowan are themselves self-confident characters in that they are confident in their understanding of the world and they are willing and eager to represent it, right? Kidos, as I mentioned before, has a very strong internal conflict that is a very long-lived conflict for him. Uh, Not necessarily long-lived as like a long-lived person. He's like 20 years old, uh, but long-lived in that his most of his life has been spent within this internal conflict state of needing to do something great. That not nothing is enough, and that internal conflict drove how he made decisions around major elements of the plot and with other people. But through the process, he still evidenced what his culture was and what his lived experience was otherwise, through a full confidence of understanding that that was what his lived experience has been all the way up to literally the today of the setting, right? He didn't necessarily leave a culture or differ from it in like vast ways. Raylan is like kind of the counterexample to that, where she was basically in defiance of everything that a Triton was. Kidos put full weight and stock into that lived experience and full value into it. That even if I had made the character to be in exile, I still would have had that character kind of reminisce back and think about all of the values that they have grown up with and that they've acquired from that lived experience and like kind of lament it, long for it, because like when I think the self confidence of a character to be the way they are, I really do think of just product of lived experience. So there I don't think there's a point at which having an internal conflict specifically counteracts that or that they are mutually exclusive. So
Huh.
that's the first example.
I'll have to try this out then
Yeah,
because from what you're telling me is like your confident character like was um like it's like from what I'm understanding it's kind of like I need to do something great but I haven't done that yet and I'm still working through that and
yeah,
I mean like I suppose I'll just need to try it right I'll just need to try it at some point because like the way that I would approach playing a character like that would be like they would probably like break at some point, right? And like kind of
hmm
um like maybe like outwardly confident but like not actually confident. So
sort of.
I'll really have to think about that.
Um, I do feel at the very least that a lot of his values were very self confidently held. It was just like the internal conflict was around his like sense of duty and needing to fulfill it and not feeling like he's done it yet.
Hmm.
Uh, that was kind of the core to his kind of character conflict, is that he needed to do something better. And bless Flonica for having recognized that and taking him aside and like saying, as her character, you know, you you are doing enough. Like I don't know how Flonica managed to figure that out because I hadn't actually talked about it with them. But
That's
like,
great. That's how.
yeah, Flonica is just a really good role player that they noticed it and then they like took Kidos aside to give that sort of speech of like, you are doing enough. Like I recognize you're doing good here. even though not many others do. And that scene immediately showed like one of the softest sides of Kidos that like has never happened before. And it immediately made Maya, that Flonica's character, the only friend that he's made on the surface. And when he came back after like leaving in a session 30 to coming back in like session whatever 70, 80 something and for Hollow and realizing that she died, that was a rough scene to play. That was very, very emotional. But it really was just like that was the pinpoint on that internal conflict that made such a huge impact on the character and how Kidos saw Maya. That like this is good, right? That scene was just incredible. But that was the first example, right?
Huh?
Second example being Rowan. Sometimes these internal conflicts can be situational, right? Rowan, in particular, kind of lives in this purely blissful ignorance and acceptance of his situation that he's totally fine with and that he has everything that he needs because implicitly he has sacrificed a lot to get to that point, but he doesn't feel that sacrifice, so he hasn't really sacrificed, right? So like you could consider that implicit sort of sacrifice. My cat just jumped on my lap, forced her way in. That implicit sacrifice is in and of itself an internal underlying conflict. But if it's not something that's felt by the character, then it's not necessarily one, right? The situational one that I would say is kind of the internal conflict that he wrestled with is when that crumbles, when you lose that, when the situation takes what you believe is your best form of existence that you've been happy with your entire life, when it's taken away from you, how do you process that? What do you do? And that became Rowan's internal conflict. Like, how do I feel safe here? How do I feel comfortable here? Now that home is gone, right? What do I call home? Like all of these kinds of different things become internal conflicts because of the situation that he's put in. Even though through his lived experience, he's entirely confident and open about the way that he has lived in this world and his perspective on the world and that being presented to other characters.
All right. Well, I suppose what I have learned here is that I feel like I've been attempting to roleplay confidence incorrectly. We'll definitely have to think about that.
Yeah, I'm down to workshop with you at some point if you wanna. If you wanna
Yeah, no,
try that.
thanks for sharing. That's something that I've been kind of like interested in. Something that I haven't had the chance to explore all that much. I guess the closest thing to confidence that I've role played was my very nihilist character, but that's you know I don't know I don't know if that counts, but um yeah gosh, I think we've been talking back and forth at each other for a while, so I suppose I just want to remind anybody who may happen to be here that if y'all have any questions for us, we are more than happy to read over those at any point. Um,
Yeah.
in the meantime, I need to think of something else because now I'm like really thinking about what you said. But I'll try to like bookmark that thought for later. Um,
I guess like I could fire one back at you then. So
sure, sure,
like
sure, sure.
what I think I kind of like know part of the answer to this, but like what's your usual kind of pattern in like figuring out internal conflicts? Like do you usually build with those first and then like kind of go from there, or like do you get the internal conflict from somewhere? Like what's your usual type of What's your usual workflow on that?
I am, I suppose, out of all the sort of like, I've done a sort of like review of the sort of like media that I like, and sort of like characters that I've played to like kind of look for any patterns. And what I can say, the thing that I like the most in like any form of media is contrast. Um, Kind of like even like slightly more general than conflict. I like taking two things that are supposed to be polar opposites and mashing them together. That's what I like doing.
Mm-hmm.
And and most of my characters kind of like end up being that way. So like the internal conflict is usually incredibly huge, right? It is like two things that should not be able to exist together, existing together. Um, a and yeah, so that's usually kind of like how I do it, is just by making it as big as possible. I suppose I can like kind of go down the list with some examples. Uh, Gosh, I don't know if I want to talk about the gang roleplay. Let's talk about Lily first. Let's talk about Lily first. That one's a bit lighter, a bit
Yeah.
um a bit easier to discuss. So yeah, Lily was a tiny cute fairy. They were there to have a good time. They were kind of like the they were a hedonist. Is kind of like the best way I can think about it, right? I was really going with the sort of like the Fae trope of like you have the Fae and they're just like having a good time, they're partying, and they just don't need to care about anything, right? They just don't need to care about things that like mortals need to care about, right? They just live in the moment and just do things, right? Whatever is in front of them that is going to give them the immediate gratification, right? That's kind of the trope that I was playing off of with Lily as a Fae. Um, and to contrast that, I was like, okay, so one day they saw a knight and they thought that knight was really freaking cool, and now like the immediate like the instant gratification that they're getting is like now they want to be a knight. And it's kind of like the impossible task of this character who is all about instant gratification, all about like kind of just living in the moment and not really caring about anything else. um Going through the motions, right? The empty motions of what it means to be loyal to your personal duty, which she absolutely does not have. She absolutely does not have a personal duty. She's just playing at it, right? She's just pretending. Um and unsurprisingly, it wasn't working out very well. She was not very good at being a knight because the she kind of lacked the capacity to to care enough about something to actually like be like in put like a sense of duty over her sense of instant gratification. Um, I kind of wished we had gotten to like I had gotten to like play that character a little bit more and like kind of like explore that a little bit more with people. Um, it kind of sort of got a little bit of exploration here, but more of but in the role play that she was a part in, most characters were kind of just like helping, trying to help her be a knight, which I don't blame anybody when when my character comes in and is like, I want to be a knight. I don't blame anyone for trying to help her be a knight. But as a role player, I explicitly didn't want her to feel like she had succeeded, because the moment that she feels like she has succeeded, that's it, right? It's the instant gratification is over. She's a knight now. She can go on to the next thing, right? And that's it. The character's done. Um, so where that went kind of wrong is like that was the character had an internal conflict between like, wanting to be in a knight and like literally being like not having the I don't even want to say like life experience because like what is life experience to an immortal fairy, right? But like so it's kind of like weird to talk about in that case, but like lacking the capacity to care enough to be a knight, um, like for real. So yeah, um, that was something that I was trying to do, and those are like two polar opposites. It becomes very character defining. It actually becomes the whole character, and I don't know. I just like contrast in pretty much everything that I do. Um,
Hmm. And that is a pretty cool kind of like internal struggle, right? Because there's this contrast between, the duty fulfilling knight and the hedonistic fairy who just wants to have fun and do what they enjoy in the moment are two very, very contrasting ideals that are trying to exist in the same place in the same person. And that's like, well, how do I do one without sacrificing the other? That's an internal conflict, right?
it's a sort of Sisyphean task because like I kind of was like very on board. I was willing as a role player to allow the character to be changed and like allow there to be a little bit of shift. I don't want to make a character that is like unable to be changed, like at all.
Mm-hmm.
um but I was most interested. I would have been most interested in the like the outcome where it is literally impossible for her, right, as a as this immortal being to understand that sense of duty. And I would have loved to like get into conflict with like some of the other knight characters who like had actually like sworn to protect somebody or something, right? And I'm just there and making a game out of it. I would have loved to get into that sort of conflict. um Unfortunately, it didn't really happen. That would have made it an external conflict. That would have turned the internal, like internally, she ended up just kind of like being a bit confused as to like, man, it's not really work. Like she can like see the other knights and she can see that they're different from her, but she doesn't know why or how, or like
Yeah.
lacks the ability to understand.
Yeah. And like evidencing that internal conflict makes it external, right? Because other
Hmm.
characters then interact with it, they form opinions, blah, blah, blah. That makes story, right? We have a question from Waffle here. I
Hmm.
am. I've read it a couple times and I had a bit of trouble kind of seeing what it was being aimed for here. So I actually do want to ask for an example. But the question is, how do you feel about intentional conflict in tone or setting instead of psychology or morals? So rather than the character having some sort of cognitive dissonance, the character experiences some sort of anachronism or clash between what they view as reality and the truth of the matter. So as a clarifying question, is this aiming toward kind of like an unreliable narrator sort of perspective? So that's what I'm kind of reading this as.
Yeah, it's just like you're questioning like what is even reality.
Yeah.
um
Shonen type protag gets shunted into a completely different genre of reality like horror. Tensional conflict in tone or setting. So I'm assuming. All right, so I'm going to kind of split this up into two steps here to kind of parse out my thoughts on this. So like I would say this is two different things, right? And I would
mhm.
very similarly equate this to Rowan's experience in Warp. Uh, I think one thing is that you have your character with their lived experience and the way they understand the world and where they come from, and then you put them into an entirely different place. And that the difference in values, the culture shock, the conflicts between the way they think and what they see around them, that is itself the conflict. And the nuances of the conflict come into evidencing what kind of differences are there and how this character interacts with this new world around them. Uh, Different genre of reality. That's that's
I think so. I have some thoughts. So I think the way the word conflict is being used in this question is very different than the way that we are using it in like the Couchform principles. And I think that's fine because I think I actually used conflict in this way earlier, like when we were talking about like, you know, I was talking about the conflict between like the shonen anime like storytelling versus like, gritty realism, right? Um, Using conflict in that context has a different meaning, I think, than the way that we describe it in Couchform. I think that sort of like setting or like tonal clash can lead to sort of character conflict in the way that we're talking about in Couchform. I don't necessarily think it guarantees it though, and it certainly has to be done carefully because the way that the it certainly has to be done carefully and intentionally at the risk of otherwise leading to that social isolation and alienation that I was talking about, where if you don't do it intentionally, if you don't do it carefully, you will just end up with a character that is just not equipped to handle the story that they are part of. If you do it intentionally, you do it on purpose, and you think about these things, right? You think about your themes. I think you can sort of get this sort of internal conflict of being the fish out of water, and I think you can then get some interesting storytelling out of that. But that's what I think is going on here. Is we're using the word conflict to mean two different things.
Yeah, it's starting to clear for me a bit too, and to bring up that kind of and to once again bring up the example that kind of equates this. I feel like Rowan was very much that, and then he lived in his in kind of the Tierkin lands world of like everything is nice and blissful ignorance, and we have everything we want and it's great and the empire is great, and then outside of that it's like this kind of sheltered understanding. I guess you could like think of this as like the sheltered perspective meeting the world around them in a very similar capacity, in that they have lived a certain way with a certain experience and a certain perspective, and then they're confronted with what the outside world is like, and it's very different, right? This is your the Little Mermaid, right? This is very much experiencing a new world, but through the same lens. And I very much think those kind of stories, again, have to be very deliberate. Like Solen said, very very deliberate, very careful, and very cognizant of what that means for that character to be in a certain place. And if it is just done haphazardly, again, yeah, you do get those like incompatibility issues. Hope that answers the question.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good question. I hadn't thought about that. Tone, setting, psychology, or morals. I'm trying to like dig into this a little bit more. Because like difference in tone definitely difference in tone or setting is very different from difference in genre. So I'm like trying to parse them individually.
Tonal clashes can be very off-putting.
Yeah.
I'll and like I can think of an example back to Worlds Apart, and once again, I'm speaking here from an outside perspective. I don't actually know how it felt like to be in this scene, but I certainly just like remember there being like a very specific tonal clash. So on one hand, you have the two troublemakers. You have Resner and Lox, like ready to pull like the greatest cannonball of their lives in the newly opened hot springs. I forget what
Oh,
they called it. They didn't call it cannonball.
the
They called it
scene.
something else.
Oh my,
Yeah, they called it something else.
Trebuchet. It was a
It was
trebuchet.
trebuchet. It was
Yeah.
the greatest trebuchet of their
Oh
lives
my
in the newly
god.
opened hot spring, right? They're just there to have some fun and cause some trouble, right?
Yeah.
And it was all fun and games until, you know, oh shoot, the slimes can't get wet. So the slime gets wet and like now they're dying. And now the scene that was all fun and games like suddenly takes a 180 in tone to be like, oh shoot, somebody's dying now, right? And that's some like tonal whiplash that can happen like really quickly in roleplay. And depending on, if you're prepared for it or not, or like kind of like depending on, uh how even like how your day has been going, that can be a pretty stressful situation to be in where you're kind of just there to have some fun, and then suddenly all the other characters like turn around on you, right? um and I think that like tonal conflicts can be really rough when they're not planned out. Um, because certain tones, the sort of like, especially I don't even want to say certain tones tend to win. It's like whoever kind of like wins or like whichever tone wins the more characters caring about it in that moment will just overpower the other. Um, so if more people are feeling like, they're ready, they just want to have a dramatic moment right now, then like the dramatic will win out. And if more characters feel like, just loosen up, it's all in good fun, then in that moment, then that's the one that's going to win out. And like either way, that can very much lead to the characters who are in the minority, being very isolated, or kind of being like forced to change their change their tone on a moment's notice.
I do feel like the dramatic tone tends to win more often than not if you have even representation between the two, because like it is much easier to sway someone from joking than it is to sway someone from being serious. That potentially explains why these sorts of scenes, when they do become dramatic, tend to like stay dramatic, right?
I
Like
agree. I agree that it's easier to sway somebody from being joking. Um, what I meant when like the joking side winning out was like sometimes the sort of the joking lighthearted atmosphere kind of like persists even though it is challenged. You can just be like,
mhm.
oh, it's just a joke. Lighten up a bit. And then the other people probably won't lighten up, but right, like sometimes if there is a majority of people that are just kind of like going around and having fun, um that it can like resist the dramatic, and I've definitely seen that happen.
Hmm. I'm I'm trying to think to the other side. Uh, Actually, you know what? True Love's Mystery is a good example. I'm gonna surface it. A good example of the other direction, right? Where a lot of potentially dangerous and alarming things have happened in the super silly fun roleplay that were then kind of dismissed as, "Oops, that's crazy," right? And it's because like very upfront, the tone of the roleplay was like very definitively communicated as lighthearted, fun, silly antics. and so there was no definitive room for exploring like big drama or life threatening situations. And like even if they did come up, it's like we can find a way to spin this and be silly and still joke around because that's kind of just what the tone of the roleplay is. And it definitely maintained that for pretty much the entire runtime I'm aware of. Like I remember watching a session where like there were these characters going through this maze with this like hideous creature that had like these sharp talons and these claws, and it was meant to be like this semi horror sort of experience. And like they would come out of that, and like it would still be the most silly thing ever that they went through that, and we're like, what was that? That was crazy. And that kind of lightheartedness was very refreshing. I want to see more role plays that are very like definitively silly like that. Cause it's like that at that point it's like you're owning it. That is absolutely the tone of the role play. Everyone kind of shares that because it's written and it's been communicated, and everyone kind of plays toward that, and that's what makes it fun. I only joined very late because I had an original character tie-in that I didn't want to like think about because of the other person that I was with. And what ended up happening was I came in really late for True Love's Mystery, which like kept me out of a lot of things because holy shit, everyone else was like already super close and I wasn't, and it was just I felt like the outsider. And coming into One Night Stand, which is kind of like the sequel roleplay, I was able to actually like participate in that from the start, and it was like basically the same sort of tone, and it was very fun. I had a good time with that for the few episodes that it ran.
Mm. Yeah.
Okay, is there anything else you think we should cover? I think we got all the big points.
I think so too. I mean, I could talk about my other character. I did want to like save that for last because like I don't really know if there is a good way to like I have to preface like some of the gang roleplay stuff with like heavy trigger warnings. I would say
Yeah.
like or like heavy content warnings because like I talk about it a lot because I love that roleplay. It was fantastic. It was amazing. But like man, once again we did some stuff. I was that's why I started with Lily on the topic of like internal conflict because Lily was generally lighthearted. Um, Foxglove was not, so I was considering like saving that example for last. Might be a bit easier than telling people to skip ahead an undetermined amount of time.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, other than that, I feel like I feel like I've kind of talked about everything that I wanted to. I suppose unless some other people have some questions, I could we could maybe like stall a little bit for that.
Then stall we shall, I guess. Did you want to talk about that example, or do we start to conclude?
Oh boy, I mean, I can if we want.
Up to you.
All right. Sure. Okay. Let's go for it. All right, everybody. Anybody who happens to be watching right now, heavy content warning coming up for suicidal ideation. I'll cut it at that. Um, all right, Foxglove. Foxglove was a character. I kind of went in just like with basically no idea what I was going to do. It took me like a month to figure out the character, like what I was going to play. But I just went in with the idea. I was like, man, I suck at acting. I can't do acting. I'm just gonna play a character that's happy all the time because I'm lazy and I don't want to act. That was literally the character idea that I went in with to gang roleplay. Um, and also because I love contrast, I was like, okay, this is gang roleplay. Wouldn't it be like, fun and contrasty to play the character that's happy all the time? in as to contrast her environment. It took me about a month to figure out what I like really wanted to do with the character and kind of like the figure out the exploration that I wanted to take part in. But this is where I ended up. So essentially, I was playing a character that was not well, not in the right place mentally. They kind of like grew up in this very dystopian, cyberpunk city, and their kind of like one light in their life was their father, who just was just an all around like genuinely nice person. Um, they had like I had imagined that like their father had like this flower shop and they were just kind of like the pillar of the community in their small corner of this dystopian cyberpunk city. And and then kind of like what I was imagining is that they had their essentially like their best friend kind of they kind of grew apart, and their best friend was essentially a corpo who then in like later in life in like a business decision kind of like bought out the entire neighborhood that they kind of like lived in, and they were going to like close it all down and like shut down the flower shop. And what this character did, and kind of the reason that she doesn't have the tragic, like her parents aren't dead, her family's alive and well, but in retaliation for this, she kills her best friend. And her internal conflict is that she idolizes her father, but does not feel like she can live up to the person that he is. She feels like she is just a bad person. She wants to be a good person, but she feels like she can't. Um, and so that's basically was the core internal conflict of this character, was trying trying to be good, but being convinced that she can't. And this is where the content warning comes in. If anybody's still kind of listening around and doesn't want to hear it, this is where it comes in. The character's explicit goal was to die. That was their goal. But they didn't just want to die. That would be too easy. That would be cowardly. What they needed, what they really wanted, and what they really needed was they wanted somebody who was like they wanted somebody who was like her father, somebody who she thought was this force of good, to tell her that she is a bad person and that she deserved to die.
Huh.
That is what she wanted. Whew. All right. Anyway, that's it. Content warning over.
So you weren't kidding about that whole contrasting bit. That is, oh man.
If potential spoiler for Code Geass. I mean, we're a bit far gone. Potential spoiler for Code Geass. I guess the protagonist there, Zero, I suppose, was a big inspiration. Anybody who has seen the ending of Code Geass will know exactly what I'm talking about. Kind of the ending of season 2 of that show.
Okay.
The way essentially what Lelouch does was essentially what she wanted, except not even as noble. Like honestly, like Lelouch is even more had like a significantly more noble goal than she had. Hers was like entirely selfish, but she wanted to go out in a similar way.
I see. Another anime that everyone tells me I need to watch.
It's really good. It's really fun. And yeah, Lelouch was a big inspiration for Foxlove.
I see.
But yeah, let's talk about thematic exploration. Um, and you know, this character existed in the same role play that and this is why like I think I talked so much about like that sense of like being together as like a community and debriefing, because like we were able to have this sort of exploration, and we were able to have this exploration in the same role play where we went to Chuck E. Cheese and had the Chuck E. Cheese mascots like get into a brawl with the gang members. And like most of the role play was definitely, you know, in that sort of like lighthearted aspect, but like when it got dark, boy did it get dark. Um like yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, my brain is short circuiting right now. Um,
This is why I saved it for the I didn't want to like put this in the middle of the podcast.
yeah, fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, I'm looking at this. I promise I won't. I was like looking at this. Perhaps the only this is perhaps the episode of Couchform that is it is the most relevant on. So I'll you know get it out here and you know not need to bring it up in the future episodes.
Mhm.
Oof. Anyway.
Well, in any case, it is yet a conflict. It is definitely on the extreme
Yep.
ends, but it is a conflict. It is
Yep.
absolutely one.
Just you know, I might be a bit you know I might be a bit far off the deep end of you know type 2 fun here. Uh,
Perhaps just a little bit.
yeah, just a little bit. You know, we like suffering.
We'll
We
figure
we
out.
like suffering safely, being you
Mhm.
know safely in the comfort of our own homes in a way that you know nobody you know nobody gets pushed beyond their limits.
Agreed.
Yep.
Yeah, we talked about that
Yeah, we
two
did.
episodes ago. Good old safety. All right. Um, I think it's about time we start wrapping up. So, there will be a little bit of time for anyone to throw in any last minute questions, but until then, I'm gonna start wrapping up by talking about what we are talking about right now is Couchform, which is the style of roleplay that focuses on building around a core theme, designed to support them, and playing to live scenarios within it. That is what this podcast is about, and the links are over there in that message that I put into the chat there. If you want to learn more about the principles, check out that doc. And the Mirror Discord server, which is what we're in right now, is the housing for this school of thought, where we discuss even further about different things in roleplay and theories and talking about other things that we want to try. And it's a really cool space. A lot of really fun ideas have been kind of shared in here recently, and I'm all for it. Do you have anything else before we sign off here, Dylan?
I don't think I have anything today. You know, the previous weeks I was very much on giving people homework, but I think I'll give it a rest this time.
No Squid School this
Well,
time.
no Squid School, not today.
I see. I see. Okay. Well, in that case, then, thank you all for listening in, and we'll see you guys next time with episode 6, where we talk about what it means to be normal, and that it's okay to be normal.
Yep.
Take care, everyone.